The Diecast Mafia invited the community to join them in a trackts build. And for that I chose this Maisto Citroën 2CV casting. As luck would have it, just as I was wrapping up this build, the guys over at the Diecast Breakdown YouTube channel announced a custom build-off to call attention to ddog, the Diecast Day of Giving. For more information about that, check out drivendreams.org. You see on the top left of the screen there information. The goal is to get 20,000 diecast cars donated by October 14th. It's a great cause. Be sure and check it out. The requirements for the build-off were that it needed to be a Maisto casting. This happened to be a Maisto casting. So it worked out really well. As you can see, this may be the ugliest Maisto casting ever made. Obviously, it's a little play-worn. I think those wheels actually are intended to be that color. I don't think that's wear. But there's dirt and stuff inside of this. It's not as bad as some I've seen, but it appears that the dirt was wet at some time because it kind of clings inside of there, as you'll see here in a second. I get this thing apart, and you know, when you're doing a custom, if you start with the ugliest thing possible, you can only make it look better, right? So there's method behind my madness. So there you see I get the base off, and yeah, there's a little dirt inside of there. There's glass in there too. You can't see it because of the mud. The interior's green. There's more dirt. And yeah, it's ugly. And I'm going to put tracks on it. I guess the dirt's appropriate since I'm putting tracks on this thing. But a lot of parts are going to go by the wayside, but I need to get the glass out of it. I don't end up keeping the glass. So I do need to drill it. There is a post holding the glass in place. So I did have to drill that post. This will be a long video to let you know at the start. This will be a long video and there will be periods of silence. Because I try and show a lot of the things I did in this process. So there you see it after it's been stripped and buffed out a little bit. You see the top. I believe that's supposed to be a rag top on there, a simulated rag top. I drill it and tap it, as I like to do. This one had nice sized posts on it, so it was easy to work with. I tapped it with the 256, tapped it 4 256 screws, as you see here, and throw those in. I do like to put other screws in. I was just testing those out at the time, but I do put longer screws typically when I'm working on it. Now the first step, I 3D printed those tracks using an FDM printer, not a resin printer, but an FDM printer, which is kind of the printers, if you're not familiar with them, that kind of look like a weed whacker line is being used to print. The car is slightly narrower at the front than it is at the rear, and obviously I can't tow in the tracks. So I go from the widest part on the car and figure out what I want to be the attachment point. This is a thick piece of styrene that I'm using here. I like to use, I've done these tracks before. If they look familiar, they're the same tracks, only printed smaller, as I did on a Winter in the Wasteland build. I think it was 2 years ago. Might have been last year's. It's tough to keep track. No pun intended. But they're the same tracks, just on a smaller scale. I cut out this thick piece of styrene and tidy it up a little bit. And then I need to figure out exactly how I want to mount the tracks, at what point on that base. And what I like to do when I'm doing tracks like this is I like to make the track section almost freestanding, as you'll see. So I figure it out, and I like the body to sit a little lower, so obviously the doors aren't going to open. I'm not going to cover the front windows, driver's side or passenger side front windows, so you just got to climb into the thing if you're going to go anywhere. You can try and squeeze through the door if you want to open it a little bit. There's a notch there, but if you're my size, it wouldn't have been practical, even at 1/64th scale. I kind of figure out the placement. And there you see after I've mounted the styrene to the tracks, just double checking that it's where I want it. And as you can see, there's some play on the sides of the body. I didn't want it right up against the body. And again, like I mentioned, the front is a little narrower than the back. So I'm going to add some styrene tubing. And again, that's just to add to the strength of it. Excuse me, that's not, actually, it's not styrene tubing, it's styrene rod. I misspoke. As I'm watching this, I'm realizing the error in what I said. And again, I'm not using CA glue here, I'm using that Plastruct that in effect melts the plastic into place. It's really strong. So I do it on the top part, and I believe I double check it here again in a second just to be sure. Yeah. And so it's fitting the way I want it, and then I flip it over, and I put rod the full length of the sides on both sides. Again, just adding to the strength. It's funny that I do this for the strength when really it doesn't need much strength. There's not a lot of weight involved here. I think the need for this strength is more in my mind than in reality. But it gives it a little more of an adhesion area so I don't have to worry about it coming apart. It's not like this thing's going anywhere. So there you see it after I have it pretty much wrapped up, that base. I like how it's sitting there. And now it's just a matter of attaching that to the base. Notice I can still get to the screws on both ends. Also notice that there's openings in the wheel wells. But I attach that. And you know, a lot of things I'll do with the pieces separate, but you need to do it all together at this point to make sure everything is hitting the right spot. You're getting the look that you want, that it's centered the way you want it. Checking and rechecking and checking again. I'm just eyeballing it at that point again, just making sure. Then I took the body off and it's time to clean the body up a little bit. This isn't going to have a pretty finish on it. So I wasn't exceptionally concerned about a lot of the cleanup on the body. I did get rid of some of the panel lines, the casting lines. There was some roughness on the headlights and that kind of thing that I wanted to get rid of. Some areas were kind of tough to get to, and you have to kind of finesse the file into certain areas. Oh, and all this was a nice casting. Don't like the way they painted it or the wheels they put on it, but I like the casting itself. So I get it where I'm pretty happy with it. And I need to fill in those front two wheel wells. You know, the back wheels are covered, but the fronts aren't. And so I get some thin styrene just draw the pattern. I'm not exceptionally careful on this because I want the end result to look like those are kind of just welded roughly in place. And I also, and I want those to have almost a bare metal kind of look, a weathered metal look at the end. But they are not painted the color of the car. They're added later, obviously. And same with the roof. This apparently is a simulated cloth roof, fabric roof. And I want it to look like they went along later and put metal panels in the roof. And that's the reason I make a choice that's coming up here. Those I just CA glue in place. Now I had this, basically it's a Warhammer part. And I've got a bunch of little Warhammer odds and ends sitting around. I think that's what it's from, if I remember right. I really like the look of this piece. I've almost used it probably 10 times before this. But I thought this is going to look really nice on the back of this, as if it's a panel that was added to make the back more heavy duty and add protection if there was, say, an attack from the rear on this vehicle of some kind. I had to put the car all together when I was doing that, again, to make sure the placement of that was in the right spot. And now at this point, I'm putting, those are, I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head right now, but the sanding mesh, as I recall, that sanding mesh that I've seen Ben over at BP Custom Creations use. And I finally bought some. I've always liked the look of it when I've seen him use it. And finally got some, and this is the first time that I'm using it. And I'm just kind of cutting those pieces to shape and figuring out the sizes and if they're going to fall where I want them to. And then I CA glue them in place. But it's interesting stuff. It has an interesting look to it. It's relatively inexpensive, and it's easier to work with than actual wire mesh that I've worked with as well. Because if you're familiar with the mesh, a lot of times you'll cut it, and you have to be careful because you'll lose strands of it. And it's a little more cumbersome than this. This works out pretty well. So thanks, Ben, for that tip. There you kind of see it, how it's coming together. I did hit it with accelerant there, in case you're wondering what that was. And I finish up putting the sides in as well. I do, as I mentioned earlier, leave the front driver's side and passenger side window open so you can enter and exit the vehicle. So now what I'm doing, I mentioned those open areas in the base where the wheels were. And I'm cutting, it's thin styrene in this case, and I'm cutting small chunks to fill in those wheel wells or close off the base portion of that. And again, because I like keeping castings like this in pieces. I don't like to just put it all together and then fill in areas. For whatever reason, I like being able to take them apart and put them together. I get joy out of that. So, oh, here's an interesting part. I use the pin vise to drill 2 really small holes, 1 in each front fender. More on that later. And here I'm masking off the bare metal on the roof. That's because I want this to look like bare metal at the into the build. And so when I paint the rest of the car, I don't paint this section. I figured, what's the best way to make something look like bare metal? Leave it bare metal. I do end up rusting it and weathering it a little. But I'm really happy with this choice. I'm really happy with the look that I end up with. I did paint this casting with camo colors, Tester's camo colors of light sand, and I peeled the masking tape off the top. That's what you saw there on my finger. So it's bare metal on the top. Had I been thinking, I would have covered the headlights, but I ended up painting those. Now I do bust out the silver paint that you see here. And I paint basically those the crappy metal fill-in wheel well blocks there that they added to the car because they added tracks to it. So I'm making that look like metal as well. And I will weather it and rust it. So it'll look a lot better than just bare silver. That back piece as well, I wanted that to look like just a very large, thick piece of metal. So I paint that as well. With the silver, I paint the headlights. And I don't recall, it might have been off camera, but I lightly go over the mesh in the windows as well. I painted the gas cap too. Almost forgot. You're going to see a lot of the painting on here, and you're also not going to see a lot of the painting. There was a lot of, after all of the detail painting is done, I do add a lot of rust to this, selected rust. Here, I'm using, as I recall, it's Wolf Gray from the Zombicide paints. If I remember right, they're Vallejo paints. Might be Army Painter. I believe they're Vallejo. But it's from their Zombicide series. And so here, what I did, I'm just very lightly using this Wolf Gray, which is actually a blue color. I mean, if you look at that, it's like a light blue-gray look. And I'm just dry brushing the heck out of this. I'm not dry brushing the areas I want to appear to be metal. I'm dry brushing the painted areas. And it's just to bring attention to some of the detail in those areas. And you can see how it's making some of the areas really stand out. Like the door lines, around the fenders, that kind of thing. It's really making those, it's really drawing your eye to those more than it did before. It gets rid of that just plain gray, or excuse me, sand look to this that I did not want. Yeah, I dry brush the heck out of it. It's fun dry brushing stuff. It's fun watching the detail come out. I love dry brushing stuff. Nuln oil! What's built without Nuln oil? I don't know that I show everything I did with Nuln oil on this, but I emphasize how I did this back section because it has some really nice detail on it. And I wanted the Nuln oil to really bring that out. You can kind of see it starting to come out now. I'm brushing it on pretty heavy there. I do want this to be rough on the back. I want it to be really rusty around the edges. I want it to, there I'm cleaning a little of the Nuln oil off with a micro brush. and then doing it a little bit better. Those micro brushes are great. I think by the time this comes out, I've already done a tip short video on them. I was realizing that I was almost out of them. I freaked out. And so here, those small holes that I drilled on the front fenders are because I'm putting flags on there. So I basically took paper, wet it, wrapped it around an axle, just an old axle. And this, you're not going to see all of the fiddling around with this, but I wrap it around the axles. Then I have these skull decals that I end up putting on there. And then after those dry, I put matte varnish on them to harden them. And then I hit them with bumble and fumble. That's where the matte varnish really, once these things air dry and then you hit them with the matte varnish, put the decal on and then hit it with the matte varnish. It hardens them up. They're a lot easier to work with. And once they've hardened, and there's the matte varnish. AK Interactive matte varnish. That bottle will last forever if it doesn't dry out first. And then once it's dry, you can slide them off the axle. And then here you see how I cut these little tiny pieces of axle, different axles. They're so freaking small that they're tough to get in the holes, especially when you're old and clumsy. But after I put these in and I use CA glue to hold these posts in place, then I think I do it off camera, but I just slide those flags onto those posts, onto these axles that are sticking out, because the matte varnish hardened them up. And then to hold it in place, I just hit it with more matte varnish. Matte varnish on something like that works as a great adhesive. That's about it. Yes, I put some lines on the roof with rust to make it look like those are individual panels, as if there were like 4 panels of metal put up there. I did hit that ugly green interior with silver paint on the top side. Didn't do any real detailing of that because I didn't want to. And it doesn't really stand out. I hit the base with some Citadel. God, I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head. But it's one of the earth-type mud. I don't think it was Sterling mud. Might have been. But just coated it with that to kind of seal it all off as well. And it's thick. It's so thick. It's like a texture paint. So when you paint that on, it's one of the thick Citadel paints. Now don't forget, check out drivendreams.org. The Diecast Day of Giving is coming. And check it all out. Do what you can. And be sure and check out their event. And I'm thrilled that they're doing this. I'm thrilled that I can mention it here. But back to the build. There's where we started. The ugliest Maisto ever. Yeah, it just seemed like fun to use a Citroën casting for this trackts build. I've done things with Volkswagen Bugs before, and this is kind of like an offshoot in a weird way. It has that feel to it. So that's where it started. Here's where it ended up. You can see how I really weathered the heck around this back to make it look like it was really just funky added on. There you see some of the fuel obviously overflowing down the sides. You see the rust around those funky metal panels that they use to cover the front wheel wells. Rust here and there. The flags on the front. This is obviously somebody important riding around in this. So there you have it. I'd like to thank the Diecast Mafia for hosting this event. This was fun. This was a lot of fun. It's always fun when you can throw tracks on something. But I hope you like this build, and be sure and check out everybody else's tracks builds. And here's some glamour shots. Thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. Let me know if you liked the length of this video or if it was horrible being this long. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe. It's free. And you'll see more of these builds. Everybody stay safe and healthy out there. I'll catch you in the next one.